I'll just let you know. There we go. Okay. Um, and we'll do the same format that we did last week. So we're looking at chapter 2 tonight of the book. And obviously, if there was things that were left unsaid from last week or whatever from the forward in chapter 1, we can address those. But if you all just have some general questions, thoughts, observations about chapter 2, we'll start with that. And then I did write down some notes like I did last week of things that I think, if the conversation starts to lag or we want to sort of refine it a little more, I have some things that I can sort of bring us back. I do want to start with one thing though, because I think it will be helpful to. So one of the things that the chapter 2 is really dealing with is the sort of rise of, obviously they talk about the sort of merging of the church, the Christian church, and the state and empire. There's that. But the other thing that they really talk about in this chapter is the rise of what is commonly known as civil religion. And that's particularly prominent in Western Europe and in North America. We're not the only places on the planet where civil religion is a prominent sort of reality. But and so I think that quote that they start with on chapter 2 from George Bush, where George Bush says, he's talking about, this is the ideal of America, is the hope of all mankind, that hope still lights our way and the light shines in the darkness. And, George Bush there is paraphrasing John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1, and then 4 and 5. And, he equates basically America as being a savior for the world, if you will. And he replaces Jesus in the quote that comes from John with the ideal of America. And I think it's interesting that you have that almost 20 years ago that George Bush did that or said this. And then if any of you watched the conventions earlier this summer, the Democratic or the Republican National Convention, you'll know that on the second to last night of the Republican National Convention, Vice President Pence spoke, and he did a similar thing. He was quoting from the Bible as well.
Sorry.
That's okay. Anyway, Vice President Pence was quoting from the Bible, and he replaced Jesus with the phrase "Old Glory." And so a similar kind of, thing happened where the vice president took out, a part of, and so he made a similar kind of connection about the United States, or in this case, the flag and the representation of the flag as being sort of symbolic like Jesus is. And both of those, the quote from George Bush and then Mike Pence, Vice President Pence, really symbolize what civil religion is, when you sort of, the confluence of sort of the Christian faith with sort of symbols and monuments and so forth from our nation. And so I just wanted to lift that up as a way to start our conversation tonight, and to then, now I'm going to open it up and let you all share your thoughts. And I felt like last week we had a pretty free-flowing discussion, so I think if we can achieve that again this week, that will be great. So have at it.
Well, I was just going to say, as I recall, that was the guiding principle for George Bush's foreign policy for his entire 2 terms, was that the spread of American democracy was what the world needed. So that certainly was not a surprise. I had never read that quote before, or didn't remember it, I guess, but it's not too surprising knowing what actually happened.
Well, that quote was a direct result of the attacks on American soil on September 11th of 2001. And the quote is a result of a speech and a ceremony that took place at Ground Zero in Manhattan as a result of that attack. When I see this quote, when I heard it, because I heard it and I saw the ceremony at the time that it actually took place, my first reaction was, this is going to be a problem. Because the quote itself, to me, is very, it exhibited a great deal of hubris. It was, we, the United States, we have been attacked, and we in our own might are going to take care of this. We are not going to allow this to stand. And we didn't. We went to war. But instead of turning to God and submitting to God and reconciling ourselves to God, we decided we had an enemy and we had to go out there and take care of it on our own. So I see this as not being religious in nature. I see this as being, a hubristic chant, although it certainly appealed to lots of people at the time and seemed like a very appropriate response. And that is a response that most people would have if they are struck or attacked verbally or physically. They are going to respond.
Isn't that the case when we use religion, especially Christianity, and mask it, or any religion, I would say, in a nationalistic and patriotic way, that's definitely a sign of hubris, I think. I think too, so last week, since you mentioned Pence, Tim, so last week, I don't know if y'all saw this, but they had a White House conference on American history, teaching the true history. And one of the themes that ran throughout that whole conference, even Pence did it too. Pence's speech before Trump came up was basically, America has been divinely touched by God. So that narrative, and then the whole speech, or the whole, it was basically like a bunch of panels and academics and other people like for charter schools talking, but linking, of course, our founding with Christianity specifically, and specifically the founding fathers, which is what the Patriot Bible, work to do. But if you look at it, that's not the case. Yes, Christianity influenced our founding, but that's not founded as a Christian nation. So the ways that those things get wrapped up into one, I think, is a lot of that hubris that we have too. And like you said, Mary Frances, it plays well.
Well, it does play well. I could argue that there is a great deal from the Bible in the American Constitution. The three branches of government comes right out of Isaiah. When you read the writings of the individual founding fathers, some of them were more or less what you would call Christian. Some didn't use the term, some did. Some history has said they're not. But when you look at the individual writings, you can make the case that these were men of God interpreting life as they saw it, and as a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic saw it at the time.
Yeah, the one thing that I wish this chapter got to a little bit, which I just thought about, was specifically the Pilgrims and the Puritans.
Right.
And them coming over, and especially John Winthrop's speech. If you look at, let him out, John Hayden. If you look at John Winthrop's Model of Christian Charity, where he talks about everybody having their place, and the ways that pastors like Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, you know, theologians that we look up to, used religion to maintain slavery, for one, specifically. But they don't talk about that, which is kind of interesting. But I don't know. I just thought about that.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges is that, I mean, Mary Frances is certainly right that many of our founding fathers and mothers were people of faith, and many of them were Christian, you know, and maybe devoutly Christian, but they were intentionally creating a country that wasn't going to be supportive of any religious tradition because of the persecution that some of our ancestors had experienced in England. And so I think the danger is that when we become, when any faith, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever, becomes too connected and enmeshed with the political structure of the country and becomes almost, you know, you can't really, you know, enmeshed in a way that you can't untangle them or disentangle them, that's where the idolatry comes in, because now you're using one arm to support the other and vice versa. And certainly our founding fathers and mothers, regardless of what their own personal religious beliefs would have been, would see the danger in that, because that was exactly what they were fleeing in England and in much of Europe. I mean, our German ancestors, our Spanish ancestors, our French ancestors, all lived in countries that were ruled by monarchies that were supported by the Christian church, either a Protestant or a Catholic version of it. And so anybody that didn't ally themselves, even if they were Christian, but weren't of the particular bent of Christianity that the monarchy was, you know, feared persecution. And so I think that's where the real tension lies. And one of the things that maybe has happened in our country today is, you know, the argument that they weren't, you know, or not a Christian nation, while that's true, maybe has pushed too far to remove the sort of religious identities of our founding fathers and mothers. And on the other side, the people that advocate that we are a Christian nation try to overstate that in a way that's the kind of ideal we should live under, and that's the kind of religious law we should have, you know. But you look at the problems in our modern society, in countries that are basic theocracies. I mean, Iran is a perfect example. It's a theocracy, and I don't think anybody in the United States wants to live in a theocracy, you know, of that sort. And I'm not saying that because they're Muslim. I'm just saying that because if you're not that particular branch of Islam, you know, you risk imprisonment or execution. And so it's not even just being Muslim in Iran, it's a certain branch of Islam that you have to practice. And so I think that's more the danger here. Richard and Bonnie, were you going to say something?
I have a frustration that our political leaders are willing to throw around the idea that we're a Christian nation and we're one nation under God, but their Christianity has absolutely no comparison to my Christianity. And I always say that it's like popular Christianity or civic Christianity. It's not biblical Christianity. It's what they say it is. And I find that so annoying that they can say that they're going to eliminate our health insurance at the same time that they're saying how Christian they are. It's just, we aren't a Christian nation. We aren't. And I find that really annoying that everybody seems to think we are.
All right.
We were originally founded on Judeo-Christian values. If you go through the Bill of Rights.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. They were all deists. I looked it up
Yeah.
today. They were all deists. They were not Christians. They said they were Christians, but they believed that God created the universe and then stepped back.
And
it
when
was
you
all
read
a-
the writings of Thomas Jefferson, particularly what has become known as his letter to something relating to the Baptist Church, it was, people are basing the separation of church and state on this letter. The reason for that goes back to something that Timothy said, which was you got to, if you were going to be a landowner in the Commonwealth of Virginia, just before the Revolution and just after the Revolution, you had to swear allegiance to the Anglican Church. If you were a Baptist, you could not in good conscience swear allegiance to the Anglican Church. I would suggest that both of those denominations will look at different things with the Bible. They will reach some of the same conclusions. They come at them differently. But it was to allow the individual to make a choice, which the Bible allows individuals to make a choice. So in that regard, you could say we are founded on biblical principles. Whether we will agree that they are Christian or not is a different issue.
I think part of the issue to think about, and that was one of the things I was going to say too, Bonnie, was the deist aspect. You have to think this is the Enlightenment as well. So this is the period of reason and science and all of this. And Jefferson's very much in line with that. You know, I started digging into the Jefferson Bible, which they talked about. And he's basically working to make the Gospels into an Enlightenment text, is what it seems like. And he's removing Christ's divinity, basically, removing the miracles, removing all of that and the resurrection from the Gospels. And even somebody like Benjamin Franklin, who in his autobiography, he lays out his steps of self-improvement or whatever. And he tacks on at the end to kind of, I guess, appease, he's writing to his son, but he tacks on at the end of these things, to be more like Jesus and Socrates, basically. So he kind of tacks that on at the end of that. So I think the thing is, I think that the biblical and the Christian influence is there. And I think that it's there because of the history and the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and everything else that came in. But I think that more specifically with Jefferson and Franklin, I don't know about all of them, I can't say it because I haven't done that research. But especially with them, it's definitely more deist, definitely more Enlightenment leaning with those discussions.
Yeah. All right. How about let's move on a little bit, because part of the dialogue of chapter 2 keeps coming back to this same problem, right? That the myth of America, when they even, talk about the 5 myths, and one of them is, we're a chosen people, the myth of nature, and then the myth of a Christian nation, the myth of us as a millennial nation, and then the myth of an innocent nation. So these kind of myths are part of our identity. And one of the things that the authors are trying to do is to help us to come to terms with them in the best way possible, because, there's not, when they use the term myth here, even though these folks aren't theologians, trained theologians, we should call them lay theologians, because they're certainly biblically knowledgeable, and they certainly have a good understanding of basic Christian theology. So they're lay theologians for sure. And one of the things when a theologian or a biblical scholar uses the term myth, it doesn't mean untruth. So myths are still true things, but you've created a sort of grander narrative, if you will, than potentially, and that's really the case here, is that the narrative, and I think Matthew bringing up Jefferson's Bible, for example, Jefferson was maybe the first demythologizer. I mean, he's really trying to do what the Jesus Seminar does today in finding the historical Jesus and cutting away all the mythology that the scriptures put upon him, and that the church for 2,000 years, or you know, in Jefferson's time, you know, 1,700 years, 1,800 years, had put on Jesus. And you know, there's some value in doing that, but you also have to recognize that there is truth in the myth. And so, and I'll just put that out there. I think that their laying out of those 5 myths, you can see that even in us trying to just talk about one of them, the myth of us as a Christian nation, is problematic. I think in a lot of ways, the myth of us being chosen people is more problematic to deal with, because that's exactly what the quote that, you know, well, Matthew's comment about this panel discussion that he was watching or listening to, you know, time and again, we come back to this idea that America was somehow divinely founded and that God sent people here as some kind of divine mission, you know, and that's what the whole notion of manifest destiny is based on. And so that creates a problematic tension for us as well, because then we get this idea of exceptionalism, and, you know, that then leads to the fact that we become saviors for the rest of the world because we're somehow more special than any other country. And that's what our burden is, to save the rest of the world. You know, and from the author's perspective, that really ties into this whole architecture of white salvation and white Jesus, because when a nation sees itself as chosen and it takes on the chosen responsibility to save everybody else, the baggage that comes with that is your cultural and racial and linguistic identity and all of that. So
And that's where, and I mean, that's where the myth of the pilgrims come in, because
exactly
because they felt that they were forming the new Canaan, basically.
right.
I mean, that's what Thomas Morton's satire about them is, English New Canaan, making fun of them. And then, of course, they're dealing with when they get here, you know, losing church membership. One other issue, though. But
Other folks?
So I didn't understand I just didn't hear what you said, the last part of your sentence.
Matthew.
oh, I was just saying that the pilgrims, of course, viewed their path over here. They were a small part of that ship, from what I remember, and it wasn't a huge group of pilgrims actually on the ship. But they view themselves as in relation to the Israelites, you know, fleeing persecution, and view the New World as Canaan, basically, as their promised land. So that whole connection has been here from the outset, especially as, of course, with the colonies. But one of the things that stuck out to me was, and the thing that you were saying too, Tim, one of the things I always think about is all of the wars that are fought in the name of God, that are both sides saying we're divinely touched, you know. And then, but the discussion of Constantine was an interesting kind of discussion, which I never thought about, because we think of Constantine as bringing Christianity, of course, to its fruition or its explosion, of course, in the Roman Empire. But then, of course, that use of empire and religion within that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Other folks, other observations from this chapter? All right, well, the one thing I thought, which is really fascinating, was the whole discussion on pages 22 and 23, when he's talking about the curse of Ham. And so probably every one of us knows the Noah story and the flood story. And most of us forget what happened, you know, after the ship, you know, reaches dry land, and they get off the ship, and Noah, drinks wine and gets drunk, and then his son comes out and sees his nakedness, and then he runs back to report to his other brothers. And rather than covering up his father and sort of, we won't get into all the sort of different biblical interpretations of what took place there or what didn't. Rather than covering up his father, he goes to tell his brothers, and then they, quote unquote, have the good sense to go and cover up the father so he's not embarrassed, and they're not embarrassed either. And then, of course, Noah, when he comes to his senses, when he sobers up, he blesses, the two brothers that covered him up, and curses not Ham, but curses Ham's son, Canaan, to be enslaved to the two other brothers. And I thought it was really interesting how the authors really played out that sort of whole narrative that in the early days, I mean, obviously we know that slavery's been around for millennia and millennia, but slavery was never really based, in the most part, racially. It wasn't based racially in Israel. It was based on, you couldn't enslave Jews, but you could enslave people that you conquered. And so slavery has mostly been either about people being enslaved because they're have financial debt, so they get enslaved to pay off their financial debt, like indentured servitude, or they're conquered people by a warring, group, and so you're enslaved. But in those cases, slavery doesn't have anything to do with the color of your skin or the language you speak or anything else. It simply has to do with the fact you were on the side that lost. And what the authors point out here is that for basically, until the 7th century, the story of Ham's curse was really connected to his son, and that slavery in that sense was connected to the sinfulness of Ham rather than the fact that, Ham might have been, dark skin or whatever. And then after the 7th century, the authors point out that the connection to the sin disappeared. And so slavery wasn't any longer really connected to someone's sin in Israel and in Christianity. And then in the 17th century, that, they misetymologize Ham's name to either refer to him being dark or black. And because the biblical story and theology had forgotten the fact that it was a curse upon his son, that then people use that story to justify enslaving dark people because they've been cursed by God. And I thought that was really a great sort of, reminding us of the true history of the biblical story, and then how over time slavery and how the Bible ultimately gets used to justify sort of racial slavery, even though it's a complete etymologizing of Ham's name, first of all. And secondly, he wasn't enslaved, it was his son, and it was based on sin. But we began to create a whole, monetary system, all of that societal system based on a biblical notion that really it wasn't even a true reading of the story itself.
I mean, that's what people like David Walker and Freedom's Journal, the first African-American newspaper, are fighting against. Those types of beliefs and those types of theories. But crap, I just forgot.
Help them out, Melissa.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I was also thinking too, the use of the Bible to justify enslavement. Romans 13 was used to justify enslavement.
Sure.
And if you notice, I don't want to get political, but dealing with this, I think you have to. If you remember a couple of years ago when I don't remember, it may have been 1 or 2 years ago when Jeff Sessions was Attorney General, and the issues at the border and the separation of families. One of the things that he said to justify the separation of families at the border was they quoted Romans 13. Him
Yeah.
and Sarah Sanders both quoted Romans 13.
Yeah.
Said that God has put people in charge and blessed them, or whatever the exact verses are. Basically, God has put people in power. And that's directly related to what enslavers did and pro-slavery people did during slavery too, was using passages like that. And then, of course, the rest of that chapter deals with love your neighbor as you love yourself, the second greatest commandment. But the ways that even the Bible and biblical verses get used, not just the country being divinely touched by God, but things like that.
Right.
No mention of Isaiah 10, that when you see an unjust law, challenge it.
Mary Frances, you still there?
I am. I think this part of the discussion goes back to something the authors said on page 21 under the heading Race and Religion. The first sentence basically is saying race is a social construct. If I quote the sentence, it says, because race is fundamentally a social construct with social implications, it has evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes back to what I said last week, that basically reality is a social construct. I would suggest it is not. Reality does not change over time. That which is socially constructed does change over time. That's what's happened with this story relating to Ham and Canaan. And while I know the biblical story, I had never heard it interpreted this way until I read the passages of this book this afternoon. I think if we allow ourselves to say that reality is something that changes, that if reality is something that changes, then reality is not truth. And
But the
so
question,
you can go ahead.
I was going to ask, so is race a reality then?
Is race a reality?
Right.
There are obviously physical differences that we can see. Does it matter? I would suggest the Bible tells us there are no Jews, there are no slaves, there male or female, that it doesn't exist. So to God, apparently race is not important. So why would it be important to us?
So what I was hearing was that if race is reality, yes, there are physical differences. What the comments getting at is race is a social construct.
That's what the authors are saying.
Yeah, that basically is getting at this, that race is not something, it's something that was constructed. So if you look, a lot of historians and scholars trace race, especially in the context we're talking about, back to the start of the slave trade in the 1400s, and specifically to the start of the slave trade and the ways that individuals used race and the Curse of Ham and other things like that to actually justify the enslavement of Africans and other individuals. So the church was involved with that too. You got to remember the slave trade started with Columbus. So when Columbus came over, he enslaved the indigenous people on the island. I don't remember the tribe, but he enslaved them. And then the church was, there was some guy from the church, I forget who it was, who was basically said, we can't do that. That's wrong. So went to the Pope or something, and they started the slave trade from Africa, Portugal and Spain did. And then that guy was basically like, we screwed up. We can't do this, but it's already been put out of the bag. So if you look at race, it's constructed in that way. Now, I would say ethnicity would be the reality. I would say race is constructed, but the issue is we've become, that's been what, 600, 700 years ago, give or take. It's become so ingrained in us that race is something biological, which it's not. It's been proven time and time again that it's not biological. You have phenotypes. Of course, that's genetic.
Agreed.
Biology does not make me as a white person superior or inferior to a black person. Okay.
Agreed.
So that's what they mean by race as a social construct, is that we use it to justify the position of people. Because you have to remember too, there were laws during slavery that basically said if you have one drop of black blood, basically you're black. So you could look like me and be black.
I am aware of those laws, but that
Yes,
doesn't.
that's what they're
make
talking
them-
about.
That's what they're talking about.
Right.
I go back to what I said last week. It is incumbent upon all of us, whatever century we live in, to reconcile ourselves to the Bible, reconcile ourselves to Christ, allow us to be transformed. Once we do that, these issues become non-existent.
Well, at least they should become non-existent, right? I mean.
Yeah, and I agree with that.
Bonnie, Richard, you were going to say something?
I'm afraid at this point, we're just listening intently. We haven't thought of anything really exciting to offer.
Well, it doesn't even have to be exciting, but I bet it will be insightful.
Well, we haven't lost interest, but we just haven't thought of something to contribute.
Great, that's okay. I just don't want to, I know it's more difficult. It's the same with Mary Frances because she's not on video either. So she can't, when we can't see your lovely faces, it's a little hard to, know what's going on back there. So, all right. I think the one of the, what was that?
I'm not the scholar of the family, so I'll lighten the mood. I'm not as deep as him,
Nobody said
but
I'm deep.
this got me to thinking about. We lived in Norway for a year, from 2018 to 2019, and attended a church while we were there.
Turn it down.
And it got me to thinking about, when you go to church on
They didn't do anything.
pretty much there's like several different times you would walk into a church in the US or a Southern Baptist church, and there's going to be flags everywhere because of the weekend that it is. That was never the case there. The patriotism did not, they're a very patriotic country.
Oh yeah, their
But
May 17th is way more
patriotism-
than July 4th.
Yeah. Patriotism never made it into church like that. And they even have certain laws about the size of the flag that you can fly at your home. And you can only fly the larger flags on certain holidays. So it's kind of interesting.
And the state does support the churches too. They
Yeah,
get
and the
money
state,
from the church. And they get money from the state.
So I just thought about that when I was reading, just seeing the church in a different country, over a year, and kind of all the holidays and everything, and how it never really came up in church.
Well, Melissa, do you think that, I mean, especially given in many Western European countries, the state does support the church through taxes, but you didn't have the Norwegian flag flying in the church. Do you think that made a difference in your worship life compared to when you go into an average church in the United States, no matter what denomination it is? You're almost always going to see probably the Christian flag along with the American flag in 90-something% of the churches that you enter in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't know how much funding this church actually got from.
Yeah, they're not the
state?
national church. They
Okay.
were.
They were like a non-denominational.
Okay, so they probably, so maybe they didn't get any funding actually.
Yeah,
I think
I think
they
they
got
got a
some.
little
We
bit. I
talked
don't think
about
they
it.
got the normal
Yeah.
amount. But I would say, you know, I grew up, you know, in Southern Baptist, and it's very much, you know,
God and country.
God, yes, God and country. America is God's country. You know, no one is, you know, you anywhere else they're not godly people, basically. Even though they wouldn't outright say that. But it's, you know, we need to send our missionaries to save all the other countries.
We need to send them to California.
Yeah.
Well,
And
California might need saving.
Oh, yeah.
but it was interesting. I was able to take part in a life group with some women that we met weekly, did Bible study, and they were from, this was an international church, so there were a lot of different cultures represented. So I, you know, had these Bible studies with women from 5 or 6 different countries, all, you know, not just European countries. And I felt like I guess I felt like a lot of what I had taken part in, and maybe this is just my experience, I wouldn't stereotype everyone like this in America, had been very artificial or very surface level, and it just seemed so much deeper and more authentic there. The worship, the prayer, the Bible study, the people, and real genuine Christians who, you know, weren't just saying we're going to send missionaries out to do the dirty work. They were doing it themselves.
Well, it's interesting you make that comment, because think of what Bonnie said at the beginning when she was saying that lots of people in the United States that call themselves Christians, she doesn't have a feeling, I mean, she doesn't see herself as the same type of Christian. And she made the comment that they seem very fake or superficial in there. And you're making a similar comment here, that the sort of group, the life group that you were part of in the church in Norway, was much more deep and sincere, at least seemingly, in their faith than lots of Americans are. So again, I think that points to one of the problems with civil religion, is that, and I don't remember if it was the authors that were talking about this or something else that I was reading, but one of the issues that civil religion sort of creates in society is that everybody already believes they're Christian because they live in quote unquote a Christian country. And because America still has the highest sort of church attendance and belief in God of all the sort of Western countries. And so therefore people just sort of feel like they're Christian, even though they don't really take their faith very seriously. And so that really impacts, sort of discipleship. And that's really what you're talking about there, is sort of a depth of discipleship that maybe is lacking in the United States. And maybe that has a lot to do with the fact that, we're much more of a civil religion kind of society, that we just have this patina of Christianity over everything that we do and everything that we say.
Yeah, that was somewhere in the book. I was going to say something about that before you said it, because patriotism is so tied to the church that people think I love my country, so therefore, I'm good.
Right. Yeah, I did see it. It is in the book. It's on page 20. I just was looking through my notes and I saw that I had actually marked that down. Other thoughts from folks on this chapter, or what we've discussed so far?
Excuse me, I wondered what other people thought of the video that we watched.
Well, I wanted to ask about that. So thanks for chiming in. What did you, Bonnie, what did you and Richard think about it?
Well, I guess, you know, a lot of this, both the video and what's in the book, we've been around a while, and it all doesn't seem new to us. I mean, it doesn't surprise us. It sometimes appalls us, but it doesn't surprise us. But that was obviously a merging of patriotism and Christianity, or potentially a superficial merging of the two. And as I think Mary Frances said, it does seem like people who think that they are patriotic then sort of automatically think that they're also Christian. That's one way of being a Christian, and that counts. And you know, you don't necessarily have to look closely at the other quote criteria for being a Christian. So I guess I thought it was amusing. I almost thought it was kind of over the top, but yeah, I got a kick out of it, but it wasn't surprising at all. Although I didn't know that such a Bible existed. I guess I wasn't surprised to find out that it did.
Well, you think it's been out for 11 years now. This was what I'm going to go buy a copy of it. By the way, I just need to confess. I need to confess that on recorded Zoom that I'm going to buy a copy of it, because I think first of all, I want to see how they wove this narrative together, because it reminds me of things like the Living Bible. Many of you remember that was really popular in the 70s. The Living Bible, which is paraphrased, and basically what that does is it takes scriptural passages and interwoven with scriptural passages are sort of, you know, whoever put the Living Bible together, their ideas and thoughts and sort of inspirational kind of things. And to the untrained reader, you start to read this and you don't know where the Bible, meaning the words of Scripture, and where the sort of paraphrased things from the authors come in. And I wonder if this American Patriots Bible, you know, obviously they gave some pictures of it, but I really want to get one and see how they weave the story together, to see if you can really differentiate as you read this, you know, between what they're, you know, the American story and the biblical story. The other reason I want to get a copy of it is that next semester I'm teaching public theology again. And if I would have known this Bible had existed the last time I taught it, I would have already had a copy. Because I think this will be a great tool in public religion or public theology to look at how our society has crafted this sort of American version of Christianity, if you will.
It does seem like the perfect example of that, doesn't it?
Yes. Oh, 100%.
What I'm really
I was going to say, I'm real curious about how they do it too, but I don't know if I'm curious enough to give them my money to find out.
I'll buy it on my budget that I have. So I'm not going to give them my personal money.
So when you get it, Tim, I want to see it, because one thing that struck me with that was they showed Frederick Douglass, they showed Martin Luther King, they showed, I think, Sojourner Truth.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how they deal with the African American, I don't know the right word, but the African American perspective, which isn't the right word.
Experience.
Especially with people like Douglass. I mean, Douglass and his "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" goes after America and whites, and basically uses the pronoun "you" throughout it, for
Right.
one. But he also goes after the church pretty blatantly. David Walker does too, but I also think about all these early activists. William Mathis, who was Native American, goes after the church, and he was a Methodist preacher. And he was basically like, the same discussions we're having now, essentially, is what they're having in the early 1800s.
Well, Mary Frances, were you able to see the video?
I did see the video. I actually own a copy of that Bible, but then
Oh
I
my
own
God.
copies of
Mary
many
Frances.
Bibles. If I could find it, my books are in storage. I would save you the price.
But Mary Frances, you're my new hero that you actually have a copy of this.
Oh, well,
I'm bowing
uh,
down to you right now because
you can definitely tell where the King James Version ends and their discussion of American history, certain events, and what different people who had an impact are the founding letters and different things. I did not read the entire Bible through. I did not read all of their commentary, but you definitely know where it ends because the King James Version is on the top. There's this big line in the
okay,
middle,
okay,
and then everything else is in a different color ink.
okay. Well,
So it's they keep it separate.
I don't. I'm a little disappointed in that actually, but because I was hoping it was really more integrated, if you will.
No, integrated is not the word that I would use. No.
Okay, well, that's okay, but I am going to buy a copy because I do think that there's, and it's great that you have it. Even if you lent it to me, I'd still buy one because I think this is a must-have for any
Well,
person.
part of it was very interesting. I learned different things, particularly about individuals that contributed to the Constitution, people that I had knew by name, people I'd never heard of.
Uh-huh.
So it was interesting that way.
Okay.
Now, do I believe that it's all completely unbiased? No.
Well,
But, I don't think it would have made it in that particular text. But would it pass an academic, say, doctoral review? No.
no. Well,
But
I'm not purchasing it because I think that the scholarship is high enough that someone earned a PhD doing this. Now there might be people that have PhDs that worked on it. That I'll grant. But
there may be. That I don't remember.
what are
You have to get a Promise Keepers Bible.
Oh yeah. Okay.
You have to get all the other, specific Bibles.
Yeah.
So actually, I think it'd be a worthwhile study.
That may be I might have to offer a special topics Bible course and do that.
Yeah, but because you have that, I know there's the teen Bibles.
Yeah.
There's the Message, which I'm not sure if that's the.
Well, the Message is, but now I only have the New Testament version of the Message. I don't have they have now the complete Bible, both old and new. That's the other question, Mary Frances. Seeing how you have a copy of this, is it just the King James New Testament, or is it the entire King James Bible with this?
It's the King James version of the Bible that.
So it's both Old and New Testament.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That was my other thing I was wondering about. All right.
So I'm surprised Matt hasn't given this example of what do they call it? Civil religion.
What example?
Because he's shared it several times.
Yeah, I was trying to be nice.
I guess we should be nice to our pastor, but so our pastor a couple of Sundays ago, there was a young man in our church going into the military, and so he called him up front and did a special prayer over him at the end of service. And he said during the prayer something about, I can't remember the exact phrase.
Thank you for blessing our country.
Yeah, thank you for blessing your country, our country. Like he had to correct himself.
Yeah.
So it was so like, perfect example of this.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing, if we're going to bring this up, the other thing too, well, the other thing is not from that, but, and I asked somebody this, and I haven't been able to find too much, I haven't really dug much into it. The Curse of Ham has been repurposed, it seems like now.
Oh, I'm sure.
For Islam.
Oh, I'm sure.
What it seems like.
Well, and that gets back to what you saw, that the authors actually mentioned that in the early days, Origen said that Ham was Egyptian, and that's why we could enslave the Egyptians.
Right.
So this is directly all the way back to Origen, who was a second century church father. So we're going way back now in church history, but that's where that's resurfaced, is because Origen made that reference, and they actually brought that up in there. So, all right. Are there any last thoughts, observations before we close out for tonight? And because I asked Joyce to pray last week, maybe that's why she took the offer to go do something with her sister. But I'll pray this week. So if there isn't any other final observations, I'll offer up a prayer before we close out. All right, let's pray. Most gracious God, we give you thanks for this time together and this opportunity to share with one another and to have deep discussion about who we are as a people and what you expect us to do as a people. All of us are trying to be the best Christian, to be the best follower of Christ that we can be. And while we slip and sometimes even stumble and fall, we know that you're there to pick us back up. And as we work through these difficult discussions and work through our difficult relationships with our brothers and sisters of color, God, we know that you're there present through that, and your grace and mercy will help us to navigate these discussions. And we just ask that you continue to bless all of us and bless those who were absent this evening from this conversation. We lift all this up to you in your Son's loving name. Amen.
Could I just say one thing, Jim?
Sure.
They talked about, and it's true that Christians believed that they needed to go and turn everybody into Christians, and that there were terrible crimes committed about other civilizations by deciding they had to become Christian. But it reminded me that the UCC had done an apology to the Hawaiian
Yep.
people. And it was done in 1993. I looked it up because I was, my memory wasn't that great. It was Paul Sherry, who was also the president who asked all churches to consider becoming open and affirming.
Right.
And the UCC is still paying reparations to the Hawaiian people. And that's why I'm part of the UCC, is because of accepting our faults and trying to do better.
Yeah.
And I just felt that that the authors were very single-minded and not necessarily aware of things that might contradict what they already believed.
Yeah, well, one of the things, and because you missed the conversation last week, all four of the authors, three of them teach at Azusa Pacific, which is a method which comes out of the Wesleyan holiness tradition. So it's a Pentecostal Christian evangelical college. And the fourth author teaches at Wheaton, which is sort of the Harvard of evangelical colleges. But that author got her PhD at Azusa Pacific, which is, I assume, how she met the other scholars. But one of the things is, although some of them grew up in the Catholic Church and one is now in a Presbyterian Church of America, most of the authors are part of the Church of Christ, not the United Church of Christ, but the Church of Christ. And so they reside in a very, very conservative evangelical world. And so while they're certainly aware of the UCC and other more mainline progressive denominations, they're probably not that really in touch with what mainline Protestantism is doing writ large, particularly because the demographics of their schools that they teach at also tend to be really conservative Christians that attend those schools. So they're probably not interacting with a lot of sort of progressive Christians on a regular basis. So I wouldn't doubt that, you know, that they wouldn't know that, but also that part of the reason they wrote this book, and we talked about it last week, is they're trying to wrestle with their own participation by being members of these sort of highly evangelical churches that tend to be rather white dominated, even though all the authors but one are persons of color. And they also are at colleges that are really evangelical and also tend to be very white in their sort of leadership and their student body and all of that. So even though themselves are persons of color, they operate really in this sort of bubble. And they do talk about that. And we talked about that some last week. But, you know, anyway, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, it is a good point, and the UCC has tried for a long time to make strides to, you know, seek forgiveness for some of its missionary ways.
SBC needs to do it.
All right, we'll gather next week at the same time, and I assume there'll be more people because the folks that were absent for birthday parties and whatnot will probably be with us. And thank you all. And chapter 3 will be on the table for next week. So, and I will try to send out a reminder. And if I find any, Matthew's always during the week sending me stuff that I should be sharing with you, but I'm sometimes reluctant to do that because he's trying to get me in trouble. So.
Well, as you noticed, I'm reluctant to share that video that I shared with you today on my own stuff. So
Yeah.
So
But,
go to Tim's Facebook page if you want to see.
there you go. Anyway, take care all, have a great night, everyone.
Yeah.
Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Bye.